Okay, so we are now going to set our eyes on the color picker, which currently is working decently. We can go in here and we can tweak the color. And as you can see, our React component is actually responding to our color changes. However, we are limited to only 3 colors in our chart style. And if we had a chart where we had many series of data, really the ideal solution is to be able to add as many colors as we want. And unfortunately, that is not a standard control. That's not a control that you can just import from some sort of external library, like the PNP controls that we've been using that includes this color picker. It's just not something that exists. So we would have to write a completely custom control to be able to handle something like this, something that can allow us to create an endless array of colors. And this is actually quite involved. If you actually want to use a custom control as opposed to one you can just import, it is quite a bit of more customization that you have to do because you have to create the code and the UI to be able to handle that. It's not just as simple as saying, here's a text box or here's this control, now make it into an array. We kind of have to write all the logic that goes into creating a property pane control. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to jump over into our solution here in Visual Studio Code. And right now we have these 3 property field color picker controls. And these are the property field color pickers that we imported from the PNP controls library. And we could create as many of these as we wanted, but we would have to hard code each one to give us 1 string back. They just don't support having an array of colors. But the good news is, because we have Office UI Fabric, if we go up to Components and go to Pickers, you'll see there is this very color picker. We can import this into any area of our web part that we want, including into our own control. So we don't even have to use the PNP color picker that we got from that package. We can create our own and just use this color picker from the Office UI Fabric in that control to kind of do a lot of the difficult work of handling the color picking itself for us. And in order to do that, what we're going to have to do is we're going to create a control in Visual Studio Code over here, and then we're going to replace these 3 color pickers with our custom control, which will use a very similar format, but it's going to be totally different and totally customizable in terms of what we can do with it. So whenever you're creating a custom control in your SharePoint Framework solutions, you're going to come over to your source folder here, and we're going to create a new controls folder. And this is going to be a folder where we can contain any custom controls that we may want to create. And over here in that controls folder, we'll create a new folder called Property Pane Color Palette. So instead of a color picker, what we're currently using property field color picker, we're actually going to create a color palette control where you can add as many colors to the palette as you would like. And within here, let's create a file called property pane color palette.ts. This is going to be the entry point, just like we have an entry point for our web part. This will kind of be the entry point for our property pane color palette control itself. And within here, we're going to need to do several things. So first of all, we're going to use a React component to actually render this because we want to use the Office UI Fabric. So let's import star as React from React. We're also going to need to create a new React DOM, just like we do in the web part here. You'll see at the top, it's importing React DOM, and then down here, it's creating an element using that. And then it's using React DOM.render. So we're going to kind of use that same pattern. We're going to import star as React DOM from React DOM. And then we need to import a couple of classes and interfaces from the SP Web Part Base package. We do need to inherit and kind of get some of the standard functionality you get with a property pane control in order to create our own custom one. So let's import iProperty pane field as well as property pane field type from at Microsoft/SP Web Part Base. And now that we've done these 3 things, we can create export class property pane color palette. Whoops, palette. I'm always going to forget how to spell that because I always either think it's 2 L's and 1 T or it's 2 T's and 1 L, which I think is correct. But this is going to implement, so we use implements iProperty pane field with an assertion of some props that are going to exist on this particular property pane field. So we do need to create an interface to describe these props. And so we can do that up here. We can say export interface I property pane color palette props. And this is kind of like defining your web part properties. It's actually this whole class that we're creating is very similar to the way they've created the web part class itself. So we need to give some properties to this property pane control. And typically you want to follow kind of the same thing that they do on a lot of the other controls, which is going to be you need some sort of label to describe this control. They all typically have a key, which is kind of a unique identifier for them. And in this case, we want an array of colors. This is going to be the ultimate output of this control is some sort of array of colors rather than a single color that's in our color palette. And we need a method here to run the onPropertyPane field changed in our web part class itself. And we've actually used this because we use that to load our list fields whenever you change your list selection in our property pane. So in this case, it's going to be the same format. It's going to be onPropertyChange, and that's going to accept property path of type string, old value of type any, and new value of type any. That's going to return void. And then typically all of your controls are going to have a disabled property that's going to allow you to disable the input. So we'll add that as well as an optional prop. Okay, so we've created this interface. Let's now replace this and inform this class that it has these properties. And within here, we need to do a couple sort of boilerplate things that you just have to do when you're creating custom control. A custom control needs to have a type, which is of type property pane field type, which we imported up above. And this is going to equal property pane field type dot custom. So we're building a custom control in this case, and the web part SharePoint Framework needs to know that this is a custom control. So we'll set this public type property on it. We also need a public target property, which is going to be a string. So all of your controls have a target property so they can kind of change which property on the web part they're actually modifying. And then we need another one here called public properties. And this needs to basically kind of be the same thing as this, but we need to do something weird to get this to work. And the first time I did this, I was like, what is that? Doesn't make any sense, but it's just kind of something you have to do. So you actually need an interface that extends this interface, but it implements another thing. You kind of need to have this idea of external and internal props for this control, and it's just an element for security reasons that they have on these property pane controls. So what we have to do is we also need to export interface I property pane color palette internal props. So these are the internal props for this particular control, and this is actually going to extend I property pane color palette props, but it's also going to extend I property pane custom field props, which will be imported up here as well. So let's break that out into multiple lines. So that's a little bit easier to read. There we go. So it's importing this from the SP web part base as well. And that's just kind of something that you need to do. You don't actually have to put anything in the interface, but you do need to create an internal props interface that extends this one, but then it also extends this custom field props, just kind of something that's required. So now that we've done this, we can go into our class down below and we can say public properties, and that's actually going to be of interface I property pane internal props. So the one we just created here. And finally, this should have a private element of type HTML element. So this is like where it gets actually rendered. And that's just, this is all just boilerplate. This is something you just need to set up when you're creating custom control. It's a little bit tedious, but you can copy and paste this from Microsoft documentation. We're kind of going through it one line at a time so we can understand how this is working. But you just kind of need to do this stuff whenever you're creating your custom controls. We should also set up a constructor down here, which is going to accept a target property of type string as well as properties of type I property pane color palette props. And then that's just going to set this dot target property is equal to target property. as well as this dot properties is equal to, and then we have to create an object here. So this dot properties is going to equal all of these things up here. So let's copy these, and we'll say for each of these, they're going to equal properties dot that value. But then it also needs to have an onRender, which is going to equal this dot onRender dot bind this. So we haven't created that method yet, but when you set your properties, you need to also have an onRender method that we'll need to create to actually render this control itself. Okay, so let's create that method now. Let's create, we'll create public render, which will return void. And that's just going to say if we don't have an element, so if this this element is falsy, meaning it's not set, we'll just simply return. Otherwise, we'll say this dot on render this dot element. And then now that we've set up this little method, we can say private on render, which is going to take that element of type HTML element, return void, and it's going to say again if this dot elem equals element. So the first time you run this, it's going to reference this dot element. And then we're kind of going to do the same thing we do in our dash web part here, where it creates this const element, and then it uses React DOM to render that element and pass props down to some sort of React component. So that's the last thing we do in this on render. We're going to say const element of type React.React element. And then that's going to accept some props that we'll create in a moment. So we'll put an empty interface in there for now, equals React.createElement. And then this will accept the React element that we create. So we'll have something called color palette that we'll create in a moment. And then that's going to pass all the properties down as props to this particular element. And then at the end, we'll say React DOM.render element elem. Like so. Okay, so this is a lot of stuff, I know. It looks a little bit crazy, but it's again, it's just kind of something we do to make sure we can render this control. And now that we've done all of this work, we can kind of pass off all the properties to just a normal React component. And then you may feel more comfortable in the context of a React component, because then it's just props and state, and you're just passing things back and forth that way. So what we'll do up here in our property pane color picker folder, we'll create a components folder, just like we have a components folder in our web part down below. And then here we'll create this color palette component. So let's create color palette.tsx. And within here we will import star as React from React, as we do in all components. And we will export default class color palette extends react.component. And then that's going to take props and state. And I think we're just going to have props in this case. So let's create an interface for that. Export interface I color palette props. And the props we want to pass down to this are going to be the colors. So that's going to be a string array. And this component can now handle doing all the color picking. It'll also need to know if we are disabled. So that's Boolean, so we can disable the controls. So we also need to notify the parent control itself that we have some new colors. So we'll have an onChanged event, which will pass in colors of type string array, and then that will return void, like so. And whoops, I put strings plural up here. I did it again down here. Silly me. Okay. So there is our props interface for this React component. And within here, let's just do our normal constructor stuff with props of type I color palette props. And that'll run a super props bind methods. And we don't have state in this case, so we won't set up initial state. This will have a public render, which is going to return a JSX element. And that will just return some control. So I'll just put in here for now color picker. Color pickers, because we're going to have multiple ones. Cool. Okay, so we've created this component called color palette. We can now import that into our control file. So let's say import color palette as well as I color palette props from component / color palette. And whoops, did I misspell something? Let me double check here. Color palette. Oh, because it's export default. So let me actually just change that to export. You can do an export default. It would just change it so you'd have to do it like this. But in this case, I'll just make them both just exportable like so. Okay, so now that we've passed this down, you'll see down here our issues went away in our render method, but now it's saying, okay, we're setting up color palette, but that has some required props on it. We need to add a colors array, for example, as a prop to this component when we're creating it. So that's pretty easy because this control already has that. We'll set colors is equal to this.properties.colors. Disabled is equal to this.properties.disabled. And then onChanged is equal to this.onChange.bind this. And that's going to be a new method that we create. Is basically going to accept from this, it's going to accept an array of colors. And then we kind of need to map that to our, up here, the onPropertyChange, which is going to take a property path, an old value, and a new value. So what we can do to write that method is down here, we'll write private onChanged, which will accept the colors string array. And that will return void. And we'll just run this.properties.onPropertyChange. And again, this accepts property path, which is going to be this.targetProperty. It accepts an old value, which will be this.properties.colors, and a new value, which is going to be the colors that were passed up from the React component. And that's going to set all the required properties there. Typically, you'll see in the controls, if you look at the open source code for all the controls that Microsoft has created, they'll also add a key prop, which is this.properties.key. So we can also pass that down as well. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. You might be thinking, whew, what the heck did we just do? And that's okay. This is just kind of what you need to do to create a custom control. We created several new files up here, as you can see. And let's actually now see if we can actually utilize this in our web part to, at the very least, get this color pickers text to show up in the property pane. So let's jump back into our dash web part. And up at the top of this file, let's import. Right here, I'll import property pane color palette from, and then we need to go all the way up to our controls folder / property pane color palette / property pane color palette. So we've imported that control into our web part entry file. And now that we've done that, we can go down to our property pane where we're actually outputting the 3 color pickers. And let's replace this with a new property pane color palette control. And this is going to take a target property of colors. And it accepts options like the label, which is going to be strings.colors, which we already set up before, not labels, but label. As well as the colors, which is equal to this.properties. And right now we have color 1, 2, and 3. So we'll reduce those down to a colors array in just a moment. And then we also need to set an onPropertyChange is equal to this.onPropertyPane field changed. We already have that method, and then we need to do .bind this. And finally, a key, which we can just call whatever we want, something unique. So we'll just say colors palette or whatever. Okay, so let's fix this issue. We have currently in the properties for this web part, we have color 1, 2, and 3. So let's change this to be simply colors of type string array. And that also means we need to open our manifest and update this to be colors. And that's going to be an array of colors. Like so. Cool. And down here where we're passing the colors down to our dash component, we were previously composing an array out of the 3 colors. So now we can just replace this with this.properties colors, like that. Okay, so hopefully now down here, this is all looking good. And let's go ahead and we should delete this so we can get rid of our old manifest defaults, add a new one, and let's edit this. And you'll see, sure enough, right there we have our React component being loaded in. Okay, so let's test out the updates on this. What we'll do is we'll switch over to our color palette control, and we'll just create an iterator in here. We'll say this.props.colors.map, and then for each color, we will return a JSX element, which will be an input with a key of, we should have a counter in here so we don't get that key warning. There we go, key of I, and then type equals text. Value is going to be bound to the color itself. So we don't want an actual text box to actually be what we're using to control the color, but this is just going to be to kind of demonstrate how we can kind of test that out. Cool. And now if we go in here and we edit this, you'll see that we have an input for each one of those controls. Now we can't update this because we haven't handled any state updates yet, but we actually do have an input for those 3 default values that we had in our web part manifest. And what we'll do now is in this method, we'll create an onChanged method to handle what happens when you update a color. So we'll say public onChanged, and we'll take a new color, which will be of type string, and an index of type number. And this is very similar to what we did way back when we were creating our pure TypeScript reminders list, if you will. So we'll say const updated colors equals this.props.colors, and then this updated colors of index is equal to new color. And then we can say this.props.onChanged, and that is expecting an array of colors, so we'll just pass it our updated colors in this case. And now we can come up here and bind the onChange event of this to take our event, which occurs on change, and we'll pass that to this.onChanged with event.currentTarget.value as well as our counter, which is our index. So this is just temporary. We're actually going to rebuild this using a color picker, obviously, but just to kind of demonstrate how you need to make changes in your custom controls, we're going to call our onChanged event and pass it a new color array in this case. All right, and now that that has saved, you will actually notice that nothing happens still when you update, and that's because we are calling the onChange, which is going up to the onProperty pane change method in our dash web part. So that's this onProperty pane field change, and it's giving it a property path, an old value, and a new value. And this super method will take care of making updates to normal controls. It kind of does that automatically, but it knows that we have a custom control in this case, so it's not actually going to make any changes to the state of our web part properties. We have to handle that ourselves in this onProperty pane field change. So what we can do down here is we can say else if property path is equal to colors and we have a new value, then let's just set this.properties.colors is equal to new value, and then we need to do a this.context.propertyPane.refresh. Okay, and hopefully now if we actually let our local workbench update here, you will see as we edit, we can actually make changes to this input box, which is great. And then as you see here, if we go down to our color palette control and open our colors array, it is going to update that there in real time. However, this is not actually being updated in real time down to our dash component. So you'll see the colors here as we update. It's not making the update in the state of our dash component. So there is one other additional thing we have to do. We just need to call this.render to kind of re-render our React application every time this value changes. And you'll see here now, if we look at our dash component, open the colors array, you'll see now as we update, the state of this is actually updating as well. So that's a lot of stuff to wrap your head around. custom property pane controls in SharePoint Framework are probably the most difficult thing that you could work with. Just a whole bunch of considerations. You have state being passed around, and it's kind of like having two different React components or React applications that are totally separate and not even talking to each other. And you have to use this dash web part as kind of the middleman to handle the communication between them and to kind of re-render and tell them, hey, you need to refresh, now you need to refresh. And it's just a little bit difficult to get started. But now that we have this, we basically have the ability to update these colors in our property pane over here. We can pass that to our React application over here. And now we have total control over how we want to render these color pickers. And not only that, but we could certainly add new items to our array, and it's automatically going to pass any length of colors that we want, any length of a colors array to our React component. And that's really why we're using a custom control in this case, because we didn't have the ability to do that before. So typically you would reach for the controls that you can just import for almost everything. But if you do find you need to do something like this, where we need something to be a little more custom and it doesn't quite handle it with those default controls, this is a good use case to spend the time that it takes to create your own custom control. Cool. Now that we have this implemented, let's go ahead and replace these inputs with an actual color picker control, and then allow for additions to this colors array inside of this property pane. What we'll do is we'll jump over into the code here. We'll go to our color palette component that we have here, which is currently iterating over our colors and creating an input for each one. And what we're going to do instead is we're actually going to have another component that's going to handle picking the individual colors. So just like we did with our reminders application, where we had a single reminder and then we had a reminders list, in this case we're going to have a color palette, and then we're going to create an individual control for each color that we'll call a color swatch. So let's create that now. Whoops, not folder, but we want to create a new file called colorswatch.tsx. And this is going to import star as React from React and export default class color swatch extends react.component. And this is going to have both props and state. So let's create interfaces for that. Let's say export interface I color swatch props, as well as export interface I color swatch state. And let's replace this down here with each of those interfaces. And then inside of the props for this particular component, we want to obviously know the color that we have in this particular color swatch. And we also need to pass up when this color has updated. So we can say on color change, we can have a prop to handle that event, which is going to take a new color and then return void. And that will notify the parent component where that can then notify our web part that the color has actually changed on this individual item. And also we want the ability to delete a color too eventually. So we'll say on color deleted, and that'll just return void. And this is the exact same thing we did with our reminders list component. We're doing the same thing in this case. We're just dealing with colors instead of a reminder string. And also, just like in our reminders list, when we had the only thing we had in our state was whether or not you're editing, we'll have a Boolean to indicate whether or not you are picking a color in this case. All right, so down here in our constructor, we'll add props of type I color swatch props, and that will run super props. That will have an area where we can bind methods as well as set default state, which will be this.state equals picking is going to be false by default. Then we'll have a public render method to return a JSX element. And this will simply return some sort of div that will have the color picker in it. So for now, what we'll do is we'll actually go to the Office UI fabric. We'll go to our color picker component, and we can import this in to our color swatch here, because we know we're going to want a color picker in there. So let's show the code for this. We need to import this color picker. So let's copy that line and we'll drop that into the top here. And then let's actually use that color picker. And that's just a color picker like this. It's actually really simple to utilize this as a pure React component. We simply color picker, and we're going to bind the color in this case to this.props.color. Now, this also has an onColorChanged event inside of this color picker, and you can find that just by looking at the documentation here. But you'll see right down here it has an onColorChange that's going to give us the color, the new color, when that occurs. So we'll just pass that to the onColorChange in our parent using this prop that we have here. So we'll say onColorChanged equals this.props.onColorChange. So we're just kind of turning around and passing whatever new color is to our parent. Cool. So with that in place, we need to go back to our color palette, and instead of iterating and outputting an input for each one of these, let's create an instance of our color swatch component. Let's go up here and let's import that first of all. Import color swatch from color swatch. And then down here, we'll create that. So we'll create color swatch equals, not equals, color swatch, color equals color. And we should set a key on this as well because it's an iterator. So key equals I. And on color changed equals, and then we'll do the same thing where we'll use an arrow function to take the new color and then map it to this dot on changed, which we wrote down below, and that accepts a new color as well as an index, which we have as the counter here. And it also needs an on color deleted method, which we're not actually calling from color swatch, but we'll go ahead and match that as well. So what we can do in this case is we can just use this same onChanged method. So this dot onChanged, or actually we'll take our arrow function and map it to this dot onChange. But we'll just set the new color value to be null, and then we'll pass in the index. And then down here, we can just say if new color is equal to null, then we will simply take our updated colors dot splice index 1. So that'll delete the color if you're setting its new value to null. Cool. And I guess we can go ahead and add a button for that in here too. We can just say down here, button on click equals this dot props dot on color deleted. And we'll put in delete text there. Okay. So now that that has been added, we have our color swatch being added. Let's give this a test. Let's open this up. You'll see we have 3 colors that are each being selected here. And hopefully, if we take a look at our dash component, as we update, it is actually updating the value. Pretty cool. And if we were to delete this first color, it's actually going to reduce that down to 2 colors. Very good. And what's cool about this now is we can add a new color. So we can have a button here that's going to have like a plus or something where we can add a color. So let's just, for now, we'll just say add color. It's going to be nice and simple. And let's create a method to actually add a new color and add it to this array so then we can create as many colors as we want. So that's going to be public add color to return void. And that will simply say const updated colors equals this dot props dot color. So we'll create a temporary variable and we'll say updated colors dot push, and we'll just push by default a black color. You can pick whatever default you want there. And then we'll just go ahead and say this dot props dot on changed updated colors, like so. And then we'll just bind this to on click equals this dot add color. And we're actually using the this keyword for both of these. I'm not sure why onChanged is working because we are using the this keyword there. I guess it just works sometimes. But let's go ahead and just in case we'll set this dot onChange equals this dot onChange dot bind this, as well as this dot add color equals this dot add color dot bind this. Cool. So let's test that out after it refreshes. give that an edit. You'll see our two colors here. If we hit add color, it's going to add a whole new control at the bottom. So we can now add as many colors as we would like, which is pretty cool. So this format is not ideal. There's a whole lot of scrolling going on. So let's clean up the style a little bit. And what I'd actually like to do is in Office UI Fabric, there's a really nice thing. I forget where it is, but it's called a callout. Maybe it's under surfaces. Yeah, callout right there. Let's go over to this one. And you'll see in the examples down here, it's just basically like a little box that pops out. And I'd actually like this. What we can do is we can have a call out that contains the color picker, and we can have a very small button that you just click on and it pops out the color picker and kind of like a hover over thing, which I think will make everything really concise and really easy to utilize. So let's come up here and we will show the code here. We will import our call out, which is right here, into our color swatch component. So let's import that now. And we also, we don't want the call out by default. It actually pops out below. I would actually, because it's going to be on the right side of the screen over here, whenever you click on the button, I want it to pop out to the left. So you can also see they have this thing called directional hint, where you can say, you know, for example, top left edge like that. That's probably a good one to use. And you'll see the code here. You actually need to import directional hint as well from this same package. So let's add that now. And now that we have that, we can come down here and we'll basically just create kind of a button that opens the color picker in the callout. And we can use this picking state to decide whether or not the callout's going to be visible. In our render method, we will have a callout, which takes a hidden property, which decides whether or not it's hidden. And so we can tie that to this.state.picking, but we want it to be hidden when we're not picking. So we'll make this the opposite of whatever the picking state is. And whenever you're using a callout, you need what is called a ref to an HTML element. And that's basically what it attaches itself to. So like in this case, it's attaching itself to a button. And let's go up here and you'll see in this example, whenever they use the call out here, it says target equals this.menubutton_element.current. And if you actually look at what this.menubutton_element is, it's a div up here where it says ref equals this.menubutton_element. And then on our class up above, it actually says private menu button element equals create ref. So this is just what's called a ref in your React components, and we do have to create one of these for this to work so it can attach itself to the right element. So what we'll do is let's close this off for now, or let's say a /callout. And then up above this, we'll create a button which will toggle picking basically. So we'll have like a pick button or something. And then what we can do is we can add a ref of this, but it needs to be bound to kind of a property. So just like they're doing here where they're creating something, I'll just copy and paste that and we'll drop it on this class. We'll create a private, we'll call it pick button ref, and that needs this create ref thing. So we need to actually import that, as you can see at the top of this here. We need to import that from this utility. So let's import that as well. Right down here. So now we have that create ref thing. We have this pick button. And then now we can say this.pick button. So that's the reference for this button. And now we can set the target for this element to be this.pickButton.current, just like they do in the example over here. Cool. So we need some sort of method when you click on this button to toggle picking on and off. So we'll say public pick down here, which will return void, and that'll just this.setState. Picking is equal to the opposite of this.state.picking. And let's bind that down here. So let's say this.pick equals this.pick.bind this. And now down here we can say button on click equals this.pick. So that'll toggle the picking every time you click on that button. And then there's also a, you can dismiss callout. So let's say on dismiss equals this.pick. So it'll toggle it back off whenever you dismiss the callout. And now within this callout, we can move the color picker into there and then tab that over like so. Great. And we also want to use that directional hint that we had imported. So let's set directional hint to directional hint dot, and then you have all these options. And I think the one we choose was left top edge. So let's give that a save. And come over here and refresh. And you'll see now we have these pick buttons. So we can hit pick and it'll actually pop out to the left every time you're picking one of these colors, which is pretty cool. And we can probably move the delete button into that call out as well. So let's move that up. And we will refresh here. And now we just have this nice little pick button where you can pick it. You can delete colors if you want from in this callout. You can add a new color and pick it from this dialog. It's all starting to work very nicely for our color picker. And what's really cool is if we actually render some data, you'll see we have 6 entries in our mock data here. So if we delete a couple of these, obviously if we have like a blue and a green and a red, so you can really tell those apart, you see it's going to repeat, but now we can add new colors and have as many colors as we want. All right, and what we can do now is we can focus on cleaning up the style a bit. So first of all, this delete button, I'm sure we can just find a button that we like in here that we can utilize. So let's just use a default button. That'll be fine. And we'll import this into our color swatch where this is being used. And now we'll come down and we'll replace our button here with default button. And then we'll give this, instead of having that format, we'll give it some text equals delete. And then we can also add an icon to this. If you look at all the properties you get on your buttons, you can add icons, and the format of that looks like this. We're going to say icon props equals, and then you give an object where icon name is equal to something. So let's go to our styles at the top here and go to icons and find something suitable for a delete operation. And that's called delete. Paste that in there, and let's just make sure this looks good inside of our callout. Cool, so we have a delete button down there. It's looking a little bit nicer. Okay, and finally, let's add a few CSS styles to this to clean it up just a bit more. So what we'll do is we will create a module for our color palette. So let's create a color palette.module.scss. And we'll also create one for our color swatch.module.scss, like so. And then in each of our components, we're going to need to import styles from color palette.module.scss. And we'll do the same thing over in our color swatch. Let's go to the top here. We'll import styles from color swatch.module. Cool. So first of all, let's add a class for this button here, the pick button. And we'll do that by saying the class name of this button is equal to styles.colorSwatch. We'll just call it the color swatch, the button itself. And actually, we don't need the text to say pick, but rather we can just output this.props.color. And by adding styles.colorSwatch, we're going to need to go into here and add a .colorSwatch class selector. And let's just give it a small border. So just in case it is a totally white background, we don't lose it in the property pane. We can see a little bit of a border. We'll set the cursor to pointer, so it looks like a link, if you will. And let's give it a height and a width of 40 pixels. We'll remove the padding from that, and we'll also set a text indent of negative a very large number. So we're basically going to hide the label for that, so all you see is a square where the button is. And the reason we're doing that is you'll see here after we get a refresh. Can I refresh? Oh, no, can't find module color palette. And again, you have to put at least one style in here or it's not going to work. So what we'll do is we'll just add one called dot color palette. And we'll put, for now, color is black or something like that. But now that we've done that, you should no longer get an error here and it will actually refresh. Cool. So now we look at this, you see we get a square for each one of these. And each one is actually a button, so I can click on it and it pops out just as before. But now what we can do is we can set the background color on that square. So I could say style equals, and again, this is an object, and we can say background color is equal to this.props.color. And so we'll get just kind of a nice square swatch, if you will, for each one of the colors that we've added. And now when we edit, you'll see there's all the colors that we've added to our color palette. Let's also clean up the delete button a bit. I think it's looking pretty lonely, shoved all the way into the corner of this callout. So let's add a div around that. We'll say footer class equals styles dot swatch actions. We'll call that the actions for this color. And then let's go in and create that dot swatch actions. And then let's just give it some padding. We'll set that to 0 for now. We'll figure out a good padding and text align right. So maybe like 15 pixels of padding. Just put in something for now. Just estimate. Okay, so we'll let that refresh here. Am I getting another error? Oh, I used the class name. Whoops. As I'm used to doing. So this actually needs to be class name. And hopefully now we'll get a refresh here. There we go. And let's go in and look at our delete button. You can see it's got some padding. I could probably tweak this a little bit more to line it up just right. So we'll set the padding to 0, 15 pixels, 15 pixels. And this, I want it to line up with that text input. So it looks like that's about 18 pixels. So we'll do 18, 18. I think that looks good. So copy and paste that into here, like so. Great. So the next thing I want to do is just fix up our color palette here so it's more of a grid, and maybe our add color button is just a big plus that's the same size as these. I think that's going to look pretty nice. So let's go into our color palette module here and let's set up some styles for that. So within here, we'll set a dot color grid. And then this will have some elements in it. So we'll basically put the grid around all of these buttons, the swatches that we have there. And we'll say for each element in there, just float left and margin 0, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 0. So we'll set a right and a bottom margin. So they're a little bit spaced apart. And then you'll have your add color button. And then that will need to be basically the same style as our color swatch. So it'll need to be, we'll need to give it a background color. Just give it a light gray. We'll need to remove the border. We'll set the color to something very light. And we'll set the cursor to pointer, just like we did with the swatches. We'll set the height to 40 pixels, width to 40 pixels. Padding to 0, and text align center. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. We haven't actually added these classes onto anything, so that's not going to look like anything just yet, but we have our color grid and our add color button. So here on our div, let's add div class name equals styles.colorGrid. And down here on our add button, we'll add class name equals styles.addColorButton. And as that refreshes, let's edit the property pane. That's looking much better. You can see our grid of colors that we have here. You can open each one of these up still and delete them, which is looking good. And you can click on add color to add new colors as needed. Cool. So let's replace add color with an icon from Office UI Fabric. So again, we can go over here to icon. Well, I'm already on icons, but we'll open up add. And I think a big plus button is just called add. That works great. So let's copy this right here. We'll go into our add button down here. And we will add an icon. And this is going to be class name. And then this is going to be icon add. We'll give that a save. Let's go back here and see what that looks like. It's probably going to be a good idea to bring the font size up on that. So we can maybe say, in addition to all the other styles we had on here, we'll say font size is 20 pixels, line height is 40 pixels. And that'll kind of center that plus right in the middle of that button. So let's add that to our add button here. And let's give it a little bit of a hover state as well. Or we'll say when you hover or when you focus over this button, let's set the background color to darken our EEE, which is our previous background color, by like 3%. I usually go real subtle when I'm doing hover background colors. But you'll see here, as we refresh and we hover over our button, you kind of get a little highlight there as you hover over it, which looks nice. Great. Okay, and anytime you add a new addition to your translated web parts, you should also make sure to update your string. So in this case, we have a couple of places where we have a string. First of all, it's probably a good idea to add a screen reader text to our add button, because right now there's no text here to indicate what this button does to visually impaired users. So let's go to our UI Fabric first of all, and we'll go to our styles and utilities, and we'll copy this screen reader only text so we can have a span class name equals that screen reader only. And within here, we can put whatever translated text we want, like add color. But we do want to translate that, so let's go up to the top and import star as strings from dash web part strings, like so. And now down here we can say strings dot in an expression strings dot add color. So we'll need to create that one, as well as on the swatch itself. I think the only place we're doing this is the delete text down here. So we'll also want to put in strings, and we need to import strings up here. Import star as strings from dash web part strings. There we go. And then back down here, we'll do strings dot delete color. So add color and delete color. Let's go to our strings interface and we'll do add color of type string and delete color of type string. And I'm going to sort this once again so they're alphabetical. We'll give that a save, and now in our English translation file, we'll add color, which will just be add color, as well as delete color, which will simply be delete. And that needs to be cased like that. Okay, cool. So let's also sort this. And our strings are good to go, and we're now localized and translated once again. And let's just test that this works just fine. We get our delete text, as well as if we inspect this, there is our add color text right there for screen readers. Cool. So that is quite a lift to be able to create a custom control, but as you can see here, we've done some really cool stuff. We have created an entirely new way to select the colors inside of this web part property pane. And not only that, but we took total control over the appearance and functionality of what is ultimately just outputting as a simple string array. We've taken total control over that and really customized that to do just about anything that we want.